fungi, and the anemones have got a soft foot and they don't excrete the calcium carbonate base, and they can move anywhere they want around the aquarium, including up the walls and the sides of the aquarium. But the anemones are not corals. There's also starfish and urchins and cucumbers and all these other things that you can put into your reef aquarium, which are beside the coral themselves. The two main types of corals that you're likely to be involved in are soft corals and hard corals. Basically, a hard coral is any coral that retracts into a hard calcium carbonate base. On the other hand, a soft coral will either contract or droop over, but into itself, not into a hard calcium carbonate base. So when a soft coral dies, nothing is basically left in that particular spot. Whereas a hard coral, when the coral dies, it's left with a calcium structure, which actually goes on to become live rock. You can really see that these soft and hard corals are really thriving in this aquarium, very much because of the water quality, the strong life and the good water flow which is offered. Even in this case, the clownfish have mistaken this coral for an anemone. Now the anemone fish and the coral don't really have a symbiotic relationship, but confused clownfish will often go into the coral for their own protection. Just as we've got our 1, 2, 3 fish, we also have 1, 2, 3 corals. So, same thing. Ask when you're purchasing your corals. Make sure that your advisor is aware of the environment you're offering, and make sure that they advise you before you buy them. Is this coral generally an easy coral to keep? Is this coral a coral that some people succeed with and other people don't succeed with? Or as a number 3, is this coral one that normally doesn't work? It really helps to have an understanding before you purchase your corals, how hard the corals are to keep, just as important as it is understanding how easy the fish are to keep before you purchase them. Now, I've been called out to this aquarium because of a fear of a disease. Now, she was quite concerned that there might be a disease or an infection going through her corals, but all it really proved to be was a series of circumstances that seemed to cultivate pretty much at the same time. Now, this aquarium's been running for quite a while, but she's recently seen some downturn in some of the corals that she's keeping. So what I'll do now is just walk you through some of these little positioning points which we really want to be aware of. Now, the first thing is the position of this Tubopora. Now, with all of these really porous corals that have got a very porous structure to them, it's really important they don't build up with sediment, because you will find that when they build up with sediment, that they tend to gather denitrifying bacteria within them, which can slowly release hydrogen sulfide, which the corals obviously don't appreciate. So with a lot of these types of corals, like the Tubopora, it's a really good idea to, on a regular basis, grab hold of it in your hand from underneath and give it a really good shake. Make sure that you get all of the mold and the detritus out of the pores of this coral. This Tubopora is also right on top of an air stone. Be aware of where your air stones come up, because a lot of the corals do get quite irritated by the constant massage of the air stone. Now, in the far corner over here, we've got a Duncanopsomnius, which has obviously fallen off the top of the reef. Now, this is a very regular occurrence with a reef aquarium, especially if you've got large fish. Now, the large fish that are quite strong will often throw around and actually relocate your corals. So you really need to be checking on a weekly or twice weekly basis to make sure the corals are where they're supposed to be and that the fish haven't knocked them over. Because when you have a coral fall over, usually not only do you lose the coral that has fallen, because it will often land on its face, but it'll often sting the coral it's landed on. One of the biggest issues of putting corals in a reef aquarium is definitely ensuring that the corals don't sting each other. Now, you can see quite clearly here that the Duncanopsomnius at the top has missing a couple of polyps because it's been stung by the Catalophilia underneath. So be really aware when positioning your corals that they're not stinging each other. This Catalophilia coral is withdrawing on the left-hand side. Now, there's two quite clear reasons for that. One is it may be getting irritated by the bubbles which are coming up very close to it, and second is it's in direct flow from the water flow outlet from the power head. So when you see this happening, one side of the coral is opening quite well, the other side is quite withdrawn, you do want to relocate this coral to ensure that it's not getting too much water flow or irritation from the bubbles. Now, if you are going to have an air stone in your aquarium, make sure that the air stone is able to come straight up to the surface and then expel the air. Make sure your air stone doesn't come up underneath any power head or pump outlets, otherwise it will blow micron bubbles through your aquarium, which can irritate some of your corals. Now, particularly with these large flat style corals, in the wild they'd be growing flat, so therefore this would be the sun source and the coral would be flat. Obviously that's not very appropriate for viewing in an aquarium because you wouldn't get to enjoy the benefits of this particular coral, but that doesn't mean you can position it like that. So often I come and see big flat brain style corals. Now the light is coming from here, whereas in the wild the light would be coming from here, therefore maximising the amount of photosynthesis that coral can enjoy. If it's sideways, it's really not receiving enough light. Sure, it's fine for viewing, so therefore keeping that coral on about a 45-degree angle is really the way to go. Now you can really see a very developed bacterial infection on this coral. I would suggest the reason why, when most of the other corals are going quite well in the aquarium, is that when you watch the particles floating around, it seems to not really have much water flow there. So the water seems to be coming around the outside here, and that particular spot there seems to be quite dead. Now it's good to follow the particles in the water, because you'll find when the little air bubbles and the particles in the water are moving quite quickly, then you can assume that there's adequate water flow over the top of the coral. Now if there's not enough water flow in that particular area, what you'll find is when the coral excretes its waste, the waste is not swept away from the coral quick enough. So therefore it almost ends up living in a layer of almost its own waste, which obviously makes it more susceptible to bacterial infections such as what you're seeing. So making sure that this area has more water flow will ensure that these corals are more likely to do well. Anemones like this one are a really popular addition to a reef aquarium. An anemone is not a coral. A coral is an animal which has a calcium carbonate base which can't actually move. It's a sensile organism. And an anemone can move around the aquarium, which can be quite a disadvantage as far as trying to keep a nice display like this one. These two anemones here are behaving very well. They're nicely on display at the front of the aquarium. But you need to remember the anemones have personalities and have the ability to move. One of the most fascinating things about the anemone is the symbiotic relationship that the anemones have with clownfish. Now clownfish use the anemone for cover and refuge, and the anemone will use the clownfish as a feeding source because the extracts of food from the clownfish and the waste from the clownfish is actually a food source to the anemone. Different types of clownfish prefer different types of anemones, and a lot of it is the personality of that particular clownfish for which anemones it prefers. So it's a matter of seeing which anemones suit the clownfish that you have, or vice versa. Probably the most fussy of all the clownfish would be the Ocellaris and Percula clowns. Now most of the tomato clowns and Melanopus clowns, they'll take to most anemones. Skunk clowns are not fussy. The anemone is an invertebrate animal, and within the anemone is zooanthelle, which is a little algae which will use the light. So in regards to food for the anemone, if you have clownfish in your aquarium, you don't actually need to feed your anemone because it'll get 90% of its energy from the light anyway, and then any other nutrients that they will need will be provided to them by the clownfish. It's quite common to see the clownfish actually run off and get bits of food and bring it back and keep it and feed the anemone itself. Though if you do want the anemone to grow, feeding it a piece of prawn or a piece of whitebait once a week certainly will help to enhance its growth. Now the anemone is capable of totally engulfing and consuming a fish. Some species of anemone, this is particularly rare for this to occur. On the other hand, with some anemones like carpet anemones, which have got a stronger sting, this may occur more often. So letting the anemones find where they want to be and then positioning your corals around them out of the anemone's reach is probably quite a good idea. This particular aquarium used to have quite a few problems with algae. Algae constantly grew because of elevating nitrate levels. Now, because this aquarium has so much live rock in it and plenty of nitrifying bacteria capacity, what we found is by reducing the amount of nitrifying media in the filter, we actually created less nitrate in the aquarium. Because if the nitrifying bacteria occurs on the live rock, it's actually parallel to denitrifying bacteria, which occurs inside the rock. So therefore, if your live rock is the point of contact for your higher level waste, so your ammonias and your nitrites are broken down on the outside of your live rock, parallel to your denitrifying bacteria inside the rock, what's actually released is nitrogen gas instead of nitrate. So if you rely on an external medium, such as bioballs, which would be in a filter like this one, all of your high level waste break down into low level waste, and the low level waste, being nitrate, keeps mounding up. And if this nitrate does keep mounding up, it means you're going to get a lot more algae in the aquarium, less buffering capacity in the aquarium, and basically have more need for water change. So in this particular circumstance, we've removed the bioballs out of this filter, and now it functions really well. The reason being is that it helps to heavily aerate. You can call this like a big oxygen chamber. And then we've got a protein skimmer on this side. What's happening with this protein skimmer is the cap goes on 3 days a week. Then when he adds his trace elements to the aquarium, he actually takes the cap off the skimmer, so the trace elements are not sucked out by the protein skimmer. So therefore you get value out of your trace elements. So when you don't have your cap on your protein skimmer, you can place this little lid on to stop the bubbles popping salt everywhere. This aquarium has never had problems with ammonia and nitrite. The problems have only ever been with nitrate. So by removing the bioballs, we're reducing the amount of nitrate by ensuring that the nitrification occurs with the live rock, which contains its parallel denitrification. In an aquarium, one of the main things you're really trying to do is imitate the natural ecosystem that the animals come from that you're trying to keep. One of the main elements you really need to understand is the natural water currents. In an aquarium, your water currents or water flow is provided by your power heads, your water pumps, or even air stones. One of the most important aspects of any aquarium is maintaining good water quality. And in order to maintain good water quality, you need to know what good water quality is and what tests you need to do to make sure that your water quality is maintained high. Now, one thing, the bigger the aquarium, generally the easier it is to maintain good water quality, because you'll experience less fluctuations in a large aquarium, and instances will have a smaller impact within a larger volume of water as opposed to a smaller volume of water where changes will occur more rapidly. A logbook is one of the best keys as far as maintaining good water quality. The logbook really allows you to keep a check of yourself, because you might swear in your heart that you tested your pH last week, but it actually wasn't last week or the week before. Because I really believe if you don't write down when you're testing things, you really don't know when it is that you've done it. Particularly with reef tanks, where you're aiming for low nutrients, you really want to look at the natural environment these animals are from. And why is it that on a natural coral reef, you'll see basically no algae with a very rich, diverse range of corals? On the other hand, not too far away, there's a river which is full of algae, which has got basically no corals at all. You need to try and imitate that particular environment. So if you're providing an environment which is high in nutrients, high nitrates, high phosphates, then you'll see your corals start to deteriorate, and you'll find your algae will actually thrive, which you could say is imitating a river. So if you are able to imitate the natural environment and provide an environment which is very low in nutrients and very high in calcium, pH and hardness, then you'll find your corals will absolutely thrive and your algae will actually struggle. No matter what sort of aquarium you've got, being aware of pH is really quite important. Now with a reef aquarium, you'll try and maintain the pH at about 8.4, because in general, the higher the pH of your aquarium, the less algae you tend to get in the aquarium, and the more stable the aquarium tends to be. On the other hand, with a fish-only aquarium, where you tend to have a lot more fish in the aquarium and there's more risk of ammonia, you tend to keep your pH a little bit lower, more like 8.1 or even 8, because as far as ammonia is concerned, which is first-degree fish waste, the higher the pH, the more toxic the ammonia. So therefore, if you're adding new fish, or if your aquarium is fairly unstable, it's probably better to maintain the pH a little bit lower, because the toxicity of the ammonia will actually be lower. There's various commercially available buffers that will increase the pH of your aquarium. So slowly add the buffers until you get the pH at your desired level. With most of the powders, it's better that you pre-mix them in aged tap water before you pour them into the aquarium to raise your pH slowly. Carbonate hardness basically helps to stabilize your pH. And in general, the higher your pH, the less algae you tend to get in the aquarium, and the more it tends to benefit the corals. So carbonate hardness is less of an issue in a fish-only aquarium, but it does help to reduce algae. But carbonate hardness is very important in a reef aquarium. In a reef aquarium, you're trying to keep the carbonate hardness very high, about 200 or 300 parts per million. Carbonate hardness is raised by buffers in the same fashion that the pH is raised. When the fish produce waste, they basically produce waste in the form of ammonia. So when proteins and amino acids have broken down, hopefully via the digestive system of the fish, what you will produce is ammonia. And ammonia is either in the form of a gas, ammonia gas, or ammonium. And the higher the pH, the more toxic the ammonia, because the more parts the ammonia will be towards the ammonia gas. So the ammonia gas, NH3, and the ammonium, NH4, are both divisions within the ammonia. So the higher your pH, the more toxic the ammonia, the lower the pH, the less toxic the ammonia. Ammonia is very toxic to fish, and you really need to make it zero under all circumstances. The only time you're really going to experience ammonia in your aquarium is if you overfeed your fish, or if there's too much waste being produced in your aquarium for what your filter can handle, because your filter is going to be growing bacteria, and the bacteria is going to be breaking this ammonia down into nitrite. So a little bacteria grows in your filter, on your rocks, on the surface of your aquarium walls, and break the ammonia into nitrite. So nitrite is basically the second phase of this cycle. Fish producing waste, the waste being ammonia, the bacteria breaking the ammonia down into nitrite. Nitrite, second degree waste, is also broken down by bacteria into nitrate. Nitrite is reduced in a similar fashion to ammonia. So there are chemicals commercially available to get rid of nitrite, sponges and other chemicals. Water changes will also help to get rid of nitrite. And as far as nitrite and ammonia are concerned, Time and the formation of bacteria will get rid of nitrite. Nitrate mainly causes algae, and with time will lower the immune system of your fish and corals, but is nowhere near as toxic as the ammonia or nitrite. The main way that you get rid of nitrate is various sponges that will suck the nitrate out of the water, or simply doing water changes, particularly using gravel siphons where you can pull the detritus out of the bottom of your aquarium and make sure your filters are well and truly maintained properly and nice and clean. Calcium and phosphate pretty much work hand in hand. In fish-only aquariums where you don't have coral, you don't really tend to focus on either calcium or phosphate, because the only negative effects of incorrect phosphate or calcium levels as far as your fish are concerned is probably a little bit more algae in your aquarium. On the other hand, with a reef aquarium, it is very important that you check phosphate, because the phosphate is going to affect the corals. So, high calcium, low phosphate, the corals love it. High phosphate, low calcium, the algae loves it. Water changes will help to reduce phosphate levels, and there's a lot of chemicals and sponges on the market which will help to suck phosphate out of the water. And one of the things that helps to mask phosphate or reduce the effects of phosphate is calcium. As far as calcium is concerned, trying to maintain it at 450 or higher is very important, and there's plenty of commercially available calciums which will help you to raise the calcium level. It's better to raise the calcium level slowly as opposed to overdose any chemicals that you do add. So if it's a liquid, you can add them slowly and progressively into the aquarium, or if it's a powder, it's best to mix the calcium with fresh water that you've added water age or two before you add the calcium to the aquarium. People often overlook the importance of salt, because salt's one of those things that will just change over time. Because as the fresh water evaporates out of your aquarium, the salt level of your aquarium will slowly increase. And it's really important before you go to the aquarium to get new fish that you check your salt level, because you don't want it to have creeped up over time. For a fish-only aquarium, we do tend to keep the salt level lower than a reef aquarium, because as far as the fish are concerned, the lower the salt level, the less problems they tend to have with pathogens, because the less osmotic stress the salt causes to their body. But as far as the reef aquarium is concerned, we try to have the aquarium with a higher salt level. The corals prefer the salt level to be 1.024 or 1.025, whereas we can actually achieve higher success with the fish, particularly if they are having problems with diseases such as white spot, with a much lower salt level, even down to 1.018. So compromising the salt level and keeping it in the middle is important for a reef aquarium, but having a slightly lower salt level is very common for a fish-only aquarium. The other thing to bear in mind is that most of your retail stores which you're buying the fish from tend to have a lower salt level too. So acclimatizing your fish slowly is very important. In a stable aquarium where you're not likely to be putting in fish anytime soon, you're probably going to keep the salt level